They called it the most elaborate oven ever built by a man with too much time and not enough sense. In the heart of the Lut Desert, where the sand reaches a blistering 158 degrees, and the air is so dry it feels like it's harvesting the moisture directly from your eyeballs, Malik began to dig. While his neighbors in the village were busy installing the latest split-system air conditioners, heavy, humming boxes of white plastic that promised a fragile sanctuary of cool, Malik was waist-deep in a trench of ancient clay. He wasn't looking for water, and he wasn't building a basement. He was carving a qanat, a subterranean canal, and above it, he was raising a 15-meter tower of mud brick and straw that looked like a jagged, hollow tooth reaching for the sun. The mockery didn't come in whispers. It came in loud, heat-exhausted shouts from across the scorched street. "Hey, Malik! Are you building a chimney to help the sun cook us faster?" Carver, the local shopkeeper, would call out while leaning against his vibrating AC unit, his forehead pressed against the cool plastic as if it were a holy relic. The village had recently been connected to a modern power grid, and for the first time in centuries, the people felt they had finally conquered the desert. They looked at Malik's tower, a Badgir, an ancient wind catcher, as a relic of a primitive, impoverished past. To them, the thick mud walls were a sign of a man who couldn't afford the future. Malik ignored them, his hands stained dark by the damp earth he pulled from the depths. He didn't have the energy to explain the fluid dynamics he had seen in the tattered pages of his grandfather's journals. He knew that the modern concrete houses his neighbors were so proud of were essentially heat batteries. The grey slabs absorbed the sun's radiation all day and bled it back into the rooms all night, creating a cycle of heat that only a roaring, expensive machine could break. Malik's tower was different. It was designed with vertical slits, precisely angled to catch the shamal, the fierce, hot winds that swept across the dunes. "You're inviting the devil into your living room," Kava warned one afternoon, watching Malik install the wooden internal baffles at the top of the tower. "That wind is 60 degrees Celsius. You open those vents and you'll be dead by sunset. Just buy the LG, Malik. Join the 21st century before you bake yourself." Malik wiped a smear of grit from his brow, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the heat haze made the mountains dance like liquid. "The wind is only the devil, if you don't know how to speak to it," Malik replied quietly. He continued to lay the bricks, each one a mixture of clay, sand, and goat hair, creating a wall nearly 3 feet thick. He wasn't just building a house, he was building a lung. He was counting on a secret that the modern world had traded for a power cord, the fact that earth, air, and water, if aligned with the right geometry, could create a coldness more powerful than any engine. As the tower neared completion, the sky over the Lut began to change. The horizon turned a deep, bruised copper, and the birds, the few that remained, stopped singing. A heat dome was settling over the region, a meteorological lid that would trap the desert's fury and press it down onto the village until the very rocks began to crack. While the villagers checked their thermostats and dialed their air conditioners to the maximum, Malik simply opened the heavy wooden door to his tower and descended into the shadows, waiting for the wind to arrive. He knew that within 48 hours, the hum of the village's machines would be replaced by a terrifying, absolute silence. By the second day of the heat dome, the village had transformed into a ghost town of humming white boxes. Outside, the air was no longer a gas. It felt like a physical weight, a searing blanket of 125 degrees that shimmered so violently the mountains on the horizon seemed to dissolve into a liquid mirage. In the modern concrete houses, the inhabitants were trapped in a desperate arms race against the sun. Their expensive air conditioners were screaming, their compressors rattling under the strain of trying to push the mounting heat out of rooms that had no natural way to breathe. Kaveh sat in his shop, the lights flickering as the local power grid groaned under the unprecedented demand. His forehead pressed against the vents of his machine, praying the plastic wouldn't melt. But inside Malik's tower, the world had changed. The physics of the ancient Badgir were beginning to wake up. At the very top of the 15-meter structure, the angled slits caught the fierce, furnace-like wind. To a casual observer, this looked like a fatal flaw, inviting the fire into the home. But as the 140-degree tough wind hit the internal baffles, it was forced downward into a narrow vertical shaft. As the air was compressed into this tight space, its velocity increased, triggering the Venturi effect. The hot air was then driven deep into the earth, where it collided with the second half of Malik's secret, the Qanat. 10 feet below the living room floor, a small, hidden canal of mountain spring water flowed through a tunnel carved into the cool, dark clay. As the scorching desert wind hit the surface of this water, a miracle of thermodynamics occurred. Evaporative cooling. The water robbed the air of its heat to facilitate evaporation, and the heavy, moisture-chilled air, now dense and cold, began to sink. It pooled at the base of the tower and was pushed out into Malik's living quarters through low-level vents. While the air outside was hot enough to bake bread, the air emerging from Malik's floor was a steady, refreshing 70 degrees Celsius. Malik sat on a woven rug in the center of the room, the silence absolute. There was no hum of a motor, no vibration of a fan, only the faint, rhythmic whisper of the wind being tamed by the mud walls. He watched a single drop of condensation form on a clay water jug, a sight that would have been impossible in any other house in the village. Through his thick, slit-like window, Malik watched Kaveh emerge from his shop to throw a bucket of water over his air conditioner's external compressor, which was smoking in the heat. Kaveh looked over at Malik's silent, windowless mud tower and shook his head, his face a mask of sweat and exhaustion. To Kaveh, the lack of noise from Malik's house was proof that the old man had finally succumbed to the heat. He assumed Malik was lying dead on the floor, a victim of his own primitive stubbornness. "Poor fool!" Kaveh muttered, his voice cracking from the dry air. He died for a pile of dirt. But the real test was still coming. As the sun reached its zenith, the village's power transformer, a grey metal box on a pole 300 yards away, began to emit a high-pitched, ozone-scented whine. It had reached its thermal limit. The modern world was about to be unplugged, and the concrete houses were about to become ovens. Part 3, the day the grid melted. At 2:14 p.m., the modern world finally broke. The main transformer at the edge of the village, a grey metal box that had been buzzing like a trapped hornet all morning, gave one final, violent crackle. A plume of black, acrid smoke rose into the white sky, and the hum that had defined the village for a decade, the mechanical chorus of 100 air conditioners, died in an instant. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was terrifying. It was the sound of 100 concrete traps losing their only defense against the sun. Inside the modern houses, the temperature began to climb with a relentless, arithmetic cruelty. The grey concrete slabs, which had been soaking up the 120-degree solar radiation for 6 hours, now began to bleed that heat into the living rooms. Without the compressors to fight it back, the houses transformed into thermal batteries. Within 30 minutes, the indoor air hit 100 degrees. Within an hour, it was 115 degrees. People began to stumble out of their front doors, gasping for air, only to find that the air outside was even worse. The village square became a scene of panicked, slow-motion survival, with elders being moved into the shade of dying trees and children crying from the sudden, suffocating weight of the atmosphere. Kaveh, the shopkeeper, sat on his porch, his face a dark, dangerous shade of purple. He looked at his silent LG unit, a useless plastic carcass now, and then at Malik's mud tower. There was no smoke, no rattle, no vibration coming from the Tower of Whispers. It just stood there, a jagged monument of earth, seemingly indifferent to the catastrophe. Kaveh was certain Malik was dead. He imagined the old man's body desiccated in the center of that windowless clay oven. "We have to get the bodies out!" Kaveh wheezed to Silas, another neighbor whose barn had already lost 2 goats to the heat. "Malik, he must be cooked by now. No one survives that tower without a fan." They approached Malik's heavy timber door with a sense of grim duty. The wood was so hot it blistered Kaveh's fingertips, confirming his worst fears. They braced themselves for a blast of furnace-like air as they heaved the door open. Kaveh even held his breath, expecting the scent of death and stagnant heat. Instead, they were hit by a wall of cold. It wasn't just a breeze. It was a firm, steady, and impossibly chilled current of air that smelled of wet earth and ancient stone. Cave stumbled forward, not from a push, but from the sheer shock of the temperature drop. He stepped into the foyer and fell to his knees. The floor beneath him was cool to the touch. The air swirling around his sweat-drenched neck was a miraculous 70 degrees. He looked up, his eyes adjusting to the dim, tranquil indigo light of the interior, and saw Malik. The old man was sitting at a small wooden table, calmly pouring tea from a clay pot. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't panting. He looked like a man sitting in a mountain cave in the middle of autumn. Above him, the Tower of Whispers was working in absolute majestic silence. The hot wind from the desert was being sucked down the shaft, stripped of its fire by the underground water, and delivered to the room as a gift from the earth itself. You're alive, Cave stammered, his teeth almost chattering as the cold air began to evaporate the sweat on his skin, chilling him to the bone. Malik set the tea down and looked at his neighbor with eyes that held no malice, only a deep, quiet sadness for the lost knowledge of his people. The clay doesn't need a plug, Cave, Malik said softly. It only needs to be asked correctly. Bring the others. The tower has breath enough for everyone. The aftermath of the Great Blackout didn't just leave the village in the dark. It left it in a state of profound, humbled realization. For 3 days, the power grid remained a melted wreck of copper and plastic, a victim of its own fragility. During those 72 hours, the modern concrete houses of the village were uninhabitable, their interiors reaching a lethal 120 degrees Fahrenheit as they trapped the desert's radiation like glass ovens. But Malik's Tower of Whispers never faltered. It became the village's lung, a silent mud-brick sanctuary where the elderly slept on the cool clay floors and children played in a 70 degrees breeze that required not a single watt of electricity to maintain. Cave, the man who had mocked Malik the loudest, was the one who spent the most time staring up at the internal baffles of the windcatcher. He watched as the hot, searing Shamal wind was sucked down the shaft, stripped of its fury by the hidden water of the Qanat, and delivered to his sweat-stained skin as a gift. He realized then that his expensive air conditioner hadn't been a tool of freedom. It had been a tether, a leash that broke the moment the grid failed. Malik's tower, however, was a partnership with the planet itself. It was an architecture of humility, one that didn't fight the desert, but moved with it. When the power finally flickered back to life on the 4th day, the expected cheer from the village didn't happen. The sound of the first few air conditioners kicking back on, that mechanical, aggressive rattle, now sounded like an intrusion. Carver didn't turn his machine on. Instead, he walked over to Malik's porch, where a dozen other men were already gathered, notebooks and measuring tapes in their hands. They weren't looking for a handout. They were looking for a blueprint. "Show us the angle of the slits again, Malik," Carver said, his voice quiet and respectful. "And the depth of the water tunnel. We've been building walls to keep the world out, but you built a way to let it in without being burned." In the years that followed, the skyline of the village changed. The flat, grey concrete roofs were slowly replaced by the jagged, elegant silhouettes of wind towers. The village became a case study for architects from across the globe, men in expensive suits who came to see how a man with a shovel and a memory of his grandfather's journals had solved a crisis that the most advanced power grids could not. Malik didn't take credit for the invention. He simply told them that the Earth had been offering the solution for 1,000 years. Humans had just become too loud to hear the whispers of the wind. Today, when the summer sun turns the Lut Desert into a shimmering forge, the village remains an oasis of absolute silence. There is no hum of compressors, no vibration of fans. There is only the rhythmic, ghost-like sigh of the wind being pulled into the clay lungs of the houses. Malik Thorne, as he became known in the journals, lived to see a generation of children who didn't know what a blackout felt like, because their comfort didn't depend on a wire. They knew that as long as the wind blew and the earth remained cool, they would always have breath.